Hello, friends, comrades, compadres, fellow creatures of life. This is our third video. We will, in our philosophy series on A.C. Grayling's A History of Philosophy. Zeno of Elea. Plato's Parmenides and Diogenes' work, Lives of Eminent Philosophers, are almost the only sources of information we have about Zeno's life. If Plato's account is correct, Zeno was born in 490 BCE and accompanied Parmenides to Athens in about 450 BCE, where the young Socrates met them. Zeno was said to be not just Parmenides' pupil, but his adopted son and his lover. He was a tall and handsome man, Plato says, and Diogenes says that his books are brimful of intellect. Aristotle said that Zeno invented dialectic, the form of philosophical argument aimed at arriving at truth, as opposed to heuristic argument, conducted merely for the sake of argument for point scoring, in part by starting from the views of an opponent and demonstrating that they lead to unacceptable conclusions. Diogenes says Zeno was a man of noble character, both as a philosopher and as a politician. For when his attempt to overthrow the tyrant Nearchus failed, he was arrested and tortured before being killed, but did not betray his friends. Nearchus was the tyrant of Elea, where Parmenides and Zeno lived. His death produced a multiplicity of legends, saying to Nearchus that he had something private to whisper in his ear. Zeno laid hold of it, the ear, with his teeth, and did not let go until stabbed to death. Another version says it was the tyrant's nose, not his ear, that he bit off. A third says that he bit off his own tongue and spat it at the tyrant rather than reveal any secrets, and this so roused the citizens that they stoned the tyrant to death. When Nearchus told him to reveal who was behind the coup attempt, Zeno said, "You, the curse of the city," whereupon Nearchus had him thrown into a giant mortar and pounded to death. One might think these picturesquely gory details are intended to enliven what anyone would think is the otherwise tale of people whose greatest excitement consists in thinking. But in fact, philosophers have had a lively time, as their biographical details often show, for ideas can be dangerous things, demanding courage to express them or live by them. Diogenes wrote a tribute to Zeno as follows. "You wished, Zeno, and noble was your wish, to slay the tyrant and set Elea free from bondage. But you were crushed, for, as all know, the tyrant caught you and beat you in a mortar. But what is this that I say? It was your body that he beat, not you." In Plato's Parmenides, Zeno is reported as saying that his arguments about the impossibility of motion and plurality are offered as a defense of the Parmenidean thesis that reality is one and unchanging. My arguments are a defense of Parmenides' argument against those who try to make fun of it, saying that if what is one, the argument has many ridiculous consequences which contradict it. Now my treatise opposes the advocates of plurality and pays them back the same and more, aiming to prove that their hypothesis, that there are many things, suffers still more ridiculous consequences than the hypothesis that there is one. In other words, Zeno's arguments have the form of a reductio ad absurdum of an initial hypothesis, by showing that contradictions can be deduced from it. Zeno created about 40 paradoxes, of which 10 are actually known. Aristotle's physics is the chief source for Zeno's arguments against motion. They can be described as follows. Suppose you are walking from one end of a stadium to the other. To do this, you must get to the halfway point. But to get there, you have to get to the place halfway to the halfway point. Indeed, to get to any point, you have to get halfway to it. But first you have to get halfway to that halfway, and before that halfway, and so on ad infinitum. But one cannot traverse an infinite number of points in a finite time. Therefore motion is an illusion. Again, consider Achilles racing a tortoise. If the tortoise is given a head start, however small, Achilles can never overtake it. For to do so, he must reach the point from which the tortoise started. But by the time he does so, the tortoise will have moved on, and Achilles must therefore reach that next point. But by the time he does so, and so on. A third argument is this. Consider an arrow fired at a target. At any point in its flight, the arrow occupies exactly the space that is its length. It is therefore motionless in that space, for says Zeno, all things are at rest when occupying a space equal to their own size. But then, because the arrow occupies its own exact space at every point on its flight, it is motionless at every point in its flight. Some answers are suggested by Aristotle himself. Zeno's argument assumes that it is impossible to traverse an infinite number of points in a finite time. But this is to fail to distinguish infinite divisibility and infinite extension. One cannot traverse an infinite extension in a finite time, but one can an infinitely divisible space, for time itself is infinitely divisible, so one is traversing an infinitely divisible space in an infinitely divisible time. As to the arrow argument, Aristotle says that it depends on the assumption that time is composed of nows, that is, discrete intervals. If this is not conceded, the deduction will not go through. Zeno's arguments are so framed as to suggest that he principally had the Pythagoreans in mind. In arguing that number is the basis of reality, they correlatively held that things are sums of units. Zeno is reported to have said, quote, "If anyone can explain to me what a unit is, I can say what things are." End quote. He here offers a classic case of deducing a contradiction from the premise that there are many things, as follows. If things are a many or a plurality, they must be just as many as they are, and neither more nor less. Now, if they are as many as they are, they will be finite in number. But if things are a many or a plurality, they will be infinite in number, for there will always be other things between them, and others again between those. And so things are infinite in number. End quote. Another argument against plurality turns on the supposition that things can be divided into parts. You have to assume that the parts themselves have to be something, because if the divisions of things finally reach nothing, how can something be composed out of nothing? Suppose you argue that the parts are not nothing, but have no size. How then can the thing they compose have size, given that no number of things without size can constitute a thing with size? So you are left with the assumption that the elements of things have to be something, and the assumption that the elements of things have to be something and with a size, but then they are not the elements of things, because they can be further divided, and if the parts in turn have size, they are therefore divisible, and their parts likewise, and so on. So the dividings can never stop. The Pythagoreans also appear to be the target in Zeno's argument against space, given their doctrine about air coming into the cosmos from outside the cosmos. If there is space, it will be in something, for all that is in something, and what is in something is in space. So space will be in space, and this goes on ad infinitum. Therefore, there is no space. Leaving aside the assumption that space is regarded as a container in something like Newton's sense of absolute space, rather than, say, a set of relationships between objects, and whether there are fallacies of equivocation, that is, multiple senses in the same word, in the words something and in, there is the question why the concept of infinite space should be intrinsically incoherent, as Zeno assumes. This raises the question of Zeno's deployment of the concept of infinity. What has to be called the standard solution to Zeno's paradoxes of motion invokes calculus, invented independently by Sir Isaac Newton and Wilhelm Gottlob Leibniz. In the 17th century, and his talk of infinity prompts discussions about actual and potential infinities, the concept of the former only receiving a full formal defense in the work of the mathematicians Richard D. Dekind and George Cantor at the turn of the 20th century. Ideas variously to the effect that the elements of physical reality cannot be infinitely divisible, that the notion of space or the perceived reality as a whole is contradictory, that there is a need to construct the para-consistent logics in which both arms of contradictions can be held to be true, are just some of the outcomes that reflection on Zeno's paradoxes has prompted. One relevant consideration for paradoxes such as the stadium and Achilles is that if you sum 0.5 plus 0.25 plus 1/8, you get 1 for intervals of both space and time. So if you sum the distances one must traverse to get to each halfway point, which is 1/2 over 1/4 over 1/8, if you sum the distances that one must traverse to get to each halfway point, halfway across the stadium, halfway to that halfway point, and so on, you get the finite distance between the two ends of the stadium. The same applies to the time that elapses for each successive act of getting to a given point, then to a next given point, and so on. Once again, the conclusion is that one can traverse an infinitely divisible space in a finite time. A suggestive result of reflection on the paradoxes is that they arise from conflicts between the conceptual conveniences we put to work to organize our experience. For example, when we are thinking of motion as a continuous event that occurs over an interval of time, we are thinking of an object traveling from one position to another position against a background of fixed reference points, and from this perspective we do not, and arguably cannot, think of the object as being successively and determinately at given points in space different from immediately neighboring points at discrete instants of time. But when we think of the object from this second and different perspective, namely the perspective of it being at a given point in its journey, we do not, and arguably cannot, think of it in the way we think of it from the first perspective, that is, as passing through that point in a way unspecifiable as a place at a time, given that this is exactly what we are doing from the second perspective. The problem, therefore, lies in us. Sometimes our ways of describing the same things for different purposes from different perspectives are inconsistent with each other. This does not entail that motion itself is illusory. Whatever the merits of Zeno's arguments individually, and however well the counter-arguments to them fare, the fact is that they further provoke reflection on the Parmenidean idea that so influenced Plato and a great deal of subsequent philosophy, the idea, namely, that appearance is not reality. Empedocles. Like Parmenides, Empedocles was born to a wealthy and influential family and played a part in the politics of the city of his birth, Anaxagoras in Sicily. Although he was an aristocrat, he favored the Democratic Party, but apparently kept his aristocratic ways, dressing flamboyantly, claiming to have superior talents and disdaining modesty about them. I go among you, an immortal god, no longer mortal, honored by you all, wreathed in garlands and crowns. He might have earned some, at least, in this reputation, because as a physician he had performed some notable medical feats, saving another Sicilian city, Selinus, from the plague, and allegedly engaging in sorcery and magical arts. Among his powers, he claimed to be able to control the winds and storms, to reverse old age, and to avert evil. To whatever famous town I go, he wrote, I am praised by men and women, and accompanied by thousands who thirst for deliverance, some asking for prophecies, and some to be cured from all kinds of diseases. His reputation as a medical man seemed to have been based on more than pretensions to magic. Galen describes him as the founder of the Italian school of medicine, equal in importance to other medical traditions of the time. His school taught that illness results from imbalance of heat, cold, dampness, and dryness, these properties in different combinations being associated with the four elements he identified as the basis of all things: fire, air, water, and earth. Some of the school's doctrines seem perceptive, as, for example, that respiration occurs through all the body's pores and not just the lungs, and is concerned with the movement of the blood. In other respects, they bear the marks of more primitive thought, for example, locating the seat of consciousness in the heart. The proximity of his home city to both Croton and Elea make it very plausible that, as he is said to have done, Empedocles studied with both Parmenides, indeed as a fellow student of Zeno's, and the Pythagoreans. One story has it that he was indeed a Pythagorean, but he was expelled by the order for stealing some discourses. The claim that he was for at least a time a Pythagorean and certainly influenced by that school is supported by the vegetarianism and belief in metempsychosis. Empedocles wrote in verse, as Parmenides had done, and was the last of the Greek philosophers to do so. There was not another great philosophical poem until De Rerum Natura by Lucretius in the 1st century BCE. Far more of Empedocles' writings survive than those of any other pre-Socratic philosopher. On one estimate, about a fifth of the lines from his poem On Nature are known. Among his other poems was one called Purifications, and he is said to have written an account of the invasion of Greece by Xerxes, a hymn to Apollo, a treatise on medicine, and plays. What is understood about his views has been influenced by the 20th century discovery of a papyri, the Strasbourg Papyri, containing lines by him, suggesting an alternative arrangement of their order, which hints at different ways of interpreting his views. Empedocles' cosmology is premised on the idea that there are four eternal and indestructible elements, or roots, as he called them, from the combinations of which all things arise. He was the first to introduce this fourfold arche. He said that things are mixtures of the four roots in different proportions, and change is the process of the four roots combining and separating when acted upon by one or other of two motive powers, which he called love and strife, respectively. These powers fluctuate in strength relative to one another, which explains how first one, then the other can result in the aggregation and then segregation of things. The cosmos is eternal and passes through cycles determined by whether it is love or strife that has the overall upper hand. In its best state, the cosmos is inert, the two powers at rest, and the four roots in unmixed separate equilibrium. It is a sphere held together by love, with strife guarding the outer periphery. The notion of a still inert sphere is Parmenidean in inspiration, but Empedocles' sphere does not long remain in stasis, for strife begins to wax in power, pulling at the bonds forged by love, and thus initiating a tug-of-war between them, from which arises the plurality of things. As strife's power grows ever greater and the struggle eventually plunges the cosmos into chaos, no life can exist in this part of its cycle, but then love's power starts to wax in its turn, and the cosmos passes through another phase of tug-of-war, in which things arise out of the mixtures of the elements. Finally, love's victory brings the cycle to another resting point of inertness, and the cycle begins again. An intriguing aspect of Empedocles' theory is his view that the combinations of elements are random, producing a multiplicity of weird things such as animals as heads on human bodies, shoulders without arms, hermaphrodites, and other such malformations, which disappear as quickly as they appear because only the well-adapted ones survive and reproduce themselves. He thought that we see by emitting streams of light from our eyes that illuminate the objects we look at, and that the whole surface of our skin is a sensory organ receptive to the effluences given off by things around us, with the combinations of elements constituting us responding to the combinations of elements and things outside us, so that we know them because of our similarity to them. He had learned from Parmenides to think of the senses as delusive, and therefore argued that we must apply reason in order to grasp the nature of things from all perspectives. From the Pythagoreans, he took the doctrine of metempsychosis, and thought with them that the acquisition of knowledge so purifies the soul that it can escape the cycle of rebirth. Empedocles' death is surrounded by anecdote, best known of which is that he leaped into Etna in order to disappear completely, so that people might think he had been assumed into heaven without dying, thus confirming his divine status. But that his ploy was found out because the boiling lava ejected one of his famous golden sandals onto the lip of the crater. Variations of this story exist, jointly prompting the couplet, "Great Empedocles, that ardent soul, leapt into Etna and was roasted whole." A more sober alternative, also recounted by Diogenes, is that he broke a thigh when old, died soon afterwards, and was buried in Megara, where his tomb was known in antiquity. Reflection on Empedocles' views, as with those of other pre-Socratics, shows that in what ways they are not as fanciful as they at first seem. The four roots, or elements identified by Empedocles, earth, fire, air, and water, can be seen as embodying or representing the forms in which physical things exist as solids, liquids, or gases, and as combinations of these. Aristotle says that Empedocles intended us to understand that fire stands in a particular relation to the other three, as acting upon them in the course of their love and strife-driven interactions. His inclusion of air, which he called aether rather than air, in order to distinguish his own from Anaxagoras' view, was based on the discovery that air is an actual physical substance. It is said that he showed this experimentally by means of a water clock, by putting his thumb over the spout, inverting it, and submerging it in water, then removing his thumb so that the trapped air bubbling out thus demonstrated its real existence to those who had been waving their hands in front of their faces to support their claim that there was nothing there. Some, rather hyperbolically, have claimed that this is the first scientific experiment on record. Consider also Empedocles' account of the forces that impel change in the form of aggregation and disaggregation of the elements. Love, philotes, some translators prefer friendship, and strife, nikos. In humans, these are emotions that govern a great many of the interactions between people. and as in other pre-Socratics, the need for an explanation of how the related phenomena of change and motion arise is attractively offered by generalization from our experience of agency, and in particular how emotions of attraction and repulsion in general explain connections and disconnections with others. In the absence of other candidates for a motive force or forces, projection from the one clear and familiar example of such a thing is understandable. Aristotle had nominated Zeno as the originator of dialectic. To Empedocles he gave the credit for being the originator of rhetoric. This was no doubt because of his reputation as a great orator and for the eloquence of his poems. And so now we have gone over Zeno, we have gone over Empedocles, and now we will go over Anaxagoras. In 467 BCE, the Greek world was stirred by a dramatic event. A large meteorite, as large as a wagon load, fell from the sky into the Aigos Potamos in the Dardanelles. From around the same time, observations were reported of a comet, now thought to have been Halley's comet. In the usual way that legends accrete around individuals of note, Anaxagoras was said to have predicted the arrival of the fallen meteorite, an impossibility and more illustrative of his reputation in his own and succeeding times than of his powers as a scientist. In addition to his intellectual reputation, he acquired another as the stereotypical absent-minded thinker who forgoes worldly things to devote himself to a life of inquiry and reflection. Anaxagoras was born in Ionia about 500 BCE, or perhaps a little earlier, making him an older contemporary of Empedocles. The doxographers say that he was a pupil of Anaximenes, but this is extremely unlikely given that the best dates we have for both tell us that Anaximenes died before Anaxagoras was born. However, what could be meant is that he began his philosophical career under the influence of Anaximenes' views, a probability supported by Theophrastus's remark that Anaxagoras was an associate of the philosophy of Anaximenes. An interesting aspect of Anaxagoras' story is that he is the first of the notable philosophers to make his career in Athens, and moreover that he arrived in Athens in 480 BCE, the year of the naval battle of Salamis, in which the Greek allies under Themistocles divisively beat Xerxes' Persians, thus ending the threat posed by the latter's invasion of the Greek world. The Persians had long been in control of the Greek cities on the eastern side of the Aegean Sea, however, including, of course, those in Ionia, which meant that Anaxagoras was technically a Persian subject. This in turn suggests that he might have come to Athens in the Persian army. Whether or not this is so, he was already a philosopher and of sufficient note as to become, so Plato tells us in the Phaedrus, tutor to the young Pericles, later the greatest statesman of the age. Anaxagoras taught him the theory of things on high, says Plato, and knowledge of the true nature of mind and intellect. A less secure tradition says that Anaxagoras was also the tutor of the playwright Euripides. The association with Pericles was a fateful one, for it probably played its part in Anaxagoras being brought to trial in 450 BCE on charges of impiety. The charges were brought by Cleon, a general of the Athenian army in the First Peloponnesian War. The Peloponnesian War was written about by Thucydides. Cleon was a political opponent of Pericles and is described by both Thucydides and Aristophanes as an unscrupulous man. The allegation in the charge against Anaxagoras related to his theory about the nature of the sun and moon, namely that the former, the sun, is a red-hot stone, and the latter is the same in substance as the earth. Pericles is said to have spoken in Anaxagoras' defense at the trial, and afterwards to have arranged for him to be released, or perhaps to escape from prison and to leave Athens. He went back to Ionia and at length settled in a colony of Miletus in the Troad at Lampsacus. When he died at the Lampsacenes dedicated an altar to truth and mind in his memory, and the date of his death was thereafter an annual school holiday for children. Apparently he had requested that this should be so. Diogenes says that Anaxagoras wrote a book in an eloquent and pleasing style. What remains of it now are some quotations from its first part, preserved by Simplicius. Like Empedocles, Anaxagoras had to grapple with the challenge posed by Parmenides, how to account for the world of plurality and change presented to us by our senses in light of Parmenidean arguments against both and the metaphysical problem of what ultimately exists. He accepted Parmenides' view that what ultimately exists must be unchangeable and eternal, to which nothing can be added and from which nothing can be taken away. He either agreed with Empedocles, assuming he knew his work, which is quite likely, or he arrived independently at the same conclusion, that coming to be and passing away are not creation and destruction, but are in fact rearrangements, mixing and separations of eternally existing elements. But he added the idea that the fundamental elements or seeds or panspermia of things are always all present together in everything, individual things being differentiated from one another only by the preponderance of one over the others, not by the absence of the others. It follows that the elements are never separated from one another into their pure forms, as Empedocles thought must happen in what he had described as the resting state of the universal cycle. What originally exists before the worlds come into existence, said Anaxagoras, is an undifferentiated and unlimited mass of stuff, consisting of an indiscriminate mixture of the seeds of things, each of them itself composed of infinitely small parts. In addition, there is nous, or mind, or reason, which acts upon this mass but puts in motion and thereby produces individual things by aggregation of seeds and their demise by separation of the seeds. Every individual thing has every kind of seed in it, but as mentioned, they will have the character of whichever one is present in the largest quantity. There was no void, no nothingness. The universe is everything there is, and in support of this he gave, as did Empedocles before him, experimental demonstrations of the real corporeal existence of air to show that it is not the nothing that the senses seem to suggest. The idea of nous, mind or reason, as the external cause acting on the mass of seeds was required in response to Parmenides' argument that body has no motive force of itself. Anaxagoras' predecessors in the Ionian tradition appear to simply have assumed that the arche is self-moving or inherently causal, but the views of Empedocles and Heraclitus had introduced the idea of causal agency separate from and additional to the elements. Love and strife, the operation of logos or nous, but it would be a mistake to think that Anaxagoras' nous is a immaterial thing, as mind came to be viewed. He says that it is the thinnest of all things, can penetrate everywhere among the other seeds, and is itself pure or unmixed, which gives it causal efficacy with respect to everything else, or as he puts it, power over the rest. Yet puzzlingly, he also says that nous knows all things, as an infinite or reason or mind knows all things. An infinite mind would do so, unless he means that it is acquainted in the sense of in contact with all things. Aristotle's criticism of Anaxagoras' conception of reason or mind is that it is merely an expedient filler of explanatory gaps. Wherever he is at a loss to explain why anything necessarily is, he drags it in. The concept works rather like the God of the Gaps argument, invoking a deity at any opportunity to explain what seems inexplicable. It is certainly hard to find a justification in the fragments for how reason or mind imparts a rotary motion to the initial mixture of things, thereby causing separation of cold from hot, rare from dense, dry from wet, and so on. Though never completely, the dry always has a little wet in it, the hot always a little cold, and vice versa. Eventually, the swirl of separation produces two separate masses, one with a preponderance of the hot, light, dry, and rare elements, the other with a preponderance of the cold, dark, wet, and dense elements. The first is aether, or fire. The second is air. Because it has a preponderance of rare over dense, fire constitutes the outside, and air, being more dense, constitutes the inside of the world. Air then aggregates into clouds, water, and earth into stones. There are many worlds, one fragment suggests, and if this is what Anaxagoras meant, he is in conformity with the Ionian tradition before him on this point. He thought that the earth is flat and rides on air. Earthquakes results from turbulence in the air under the earth. He said that rivers get their water from rain and the ocean get their water from rivers through the Nile, though the Nile gets its water from snows melting in Ethiopia. The stars are stones that were torn from earth and made red hot by the speed of their flight, but we do not feel their heat because they are too far away. They, along with the sun and moon, which are also hot stones, are carried by the rotary motion of the air. The sun is, more accurately, feels hotter than the stars because it is not so far up. It is bigger than the Peloponnese, and its light is reflected from the moon as moonlight. Lunar eclipses occur when the moon passes into the shadow cast by the earth when it is between the sun and moon. Much of this is very astute. Anaxagoras must have had exceptionally clear eyesight, for he said that the moon, which is the same as the earth in physical composition, has plains and valleys in it. But he was perceptive in other ways too. He said that plants are living creatures, and they and animals, of course, come from the same original panspermia or seeds of things, differing only by the admixtures within them. The theory of perception is what we sense things we sense things by opposites, as when I sense that the same bowl of water is cool if my hand is hot, but warm if my hand is cool. The image on the pupil of the eye has to be a different color from the pupil in order to be seen. We see less well at night because things then have colors closer to the color of the eye's pupil. Anaxagoras is an interesting case study in the pre-Socratic moment of philosophy because in his theory of combination of a priori reasoning and inductions from observation, typical enough not just of philosophy's beginnings but of its entire history, manifests itself in clear outline. What he says about the source of river water, eclipses of the moon, and some of the phenomena of sensory perception interestingly anticipates not just later views but the possibility of empirical verification of them. What he accepts from Parmenides about how reality has to be, namely eternal and unchanging in its fundamental nature, and how he solves the problem of this raises how therefore can there be change, growth, and decay, is a paradigm of philosophy's early grappling with the question of appearance and reality, the perennial problem. His approach to these questions is a paradigm in another way too, of reason operating on observation, when these are the only available instruments of inquiry.